Hello and welcome to now this third episode of the Miramichi Historical Linkages podcast. So thanks very much for joining us again. And if this is your first episode, like I say, there's 2 more episodes that we've already done. So be sure to go back and check those out as well. So in our first 2 episodes, we talked a little bit about ourselves. We talked a little bit about the project. And now we're going to kind of get into the meat and potatoes of what we've been into now for the last, 8 or 9 months. The interviews themselves. We touched on it a little bit last time, but today we'll be going into a little bit more detail about what we were kind of expecting when we went into those interviews, how we conducted them, and, things of that nature. So, once again, I am Sean McCarthy. I'm joined by Alison Paradis, Tasha Smith, and Sarah Ward. So, welcome everybody.
Thank you. I was interested in kind of talking about our interview process because I know that as the person conducting the interview, I was nervous when we were first starting, thinking like, do I show up prepared with like a list of questions and, how long is a good interview and is this going to be too short, or is the person I'm interviewing going to feel, bored or pressured, or how are they going to think that this process is going? So I thought maybe if we visit a little bit about how we go about our interviews now that we've done quite a few, and we as interviewers are more comfortable, then maybe we can kind of open the door for people who might have stories or who might have information or research that they've done that they'd like to share with us, and make them feel a little bit more at ease, a little bit more comfortable, so they're not worrying about the same things we all worried about when we started.
I agree, because it's good to show that all interviews are different too. Like you said, depending on the length or if it's good or not, they're all great. And another thing I think would be great to point out is realizing that an interview is not just one and done. You usually go back more than once and have more than one conversation. And then you can piece all those pieces together and
exactly.
make a bigger picture.
And I know that at the beginning, a lot of my interviews, I would go in expecting to kind of have just to walk away with like a list of new information. And instead I would leave with a list of like 10 people that I should contact for more interviews. So there were a lot of like little surprises like that, I think, with the interview process that that ended up making this project just more fun and a little bit more intricate and more detailed.
All the hidden treasures.
Exactly, right?
I'd say one interesting thing about a lot of the interviews I've done, I think mostly all of them, they either knew a family member of mine or were a family member or are a family member of mine. So I thought that was quite interesting and fun. Like you said, it's all the connections. You find out how small the world really is. Like it's not just a saying.
Yeah, really. Most of my interviews, if not all of them, I would say from the very beginning of the conversation, the first 2 minutes, I would say, on average, was the interviewee telling me about how they couldn't really think of anything that would be worth sharing. And then those interviews usually went on to be an hour or 2 filled with great information.
Same exact experiences. It was quite funny because I noticed the pattern. I was like, oh. The second interviews were always funner too, because then they're everyone's more relaxed.
Yes.
They're like, the introduction part kind of out of the way, and then they think of stuff too over time, or you think of questions over time until you see them again. Then you're like, hey, I was wondering about this.
So I have a question for you guys for when it comes to picking the people that you're interviewing. So did you guys kind of like go in with just this list of people, or was it you did research and found names through research, or what was your process when you started to come up with this list of people to interview?
Well, I mean, I guess I would just answer yes. I did both those things. I started off with with some people that I thought could be able to kind of tell me some things. I guess people that I knew were, for lack of a better word, maybe experts or very experienced in some aspect of the past, and that I wanted to kind of learn a little bit more about. So that would kind of be a stepping off point for those interviews. I would kind of say, okay, well, I know you know a lot about, the the foundation of the Irish Festival. Well, tell me how that started, and then let's use that as kind of our stepping off point, and then we can kind of go from there. But then at the same time, there were opportunities just to kind of sit down with other people, and kind of like what you say, Ali, I didn't so much as interview them, but they just told me, okay, well, here's a list of people that you can kind of talk to, so there were interviews that were very kind of historical, but then there were ones that were much more about kind of networking. And were much more about, because I met with the Historical Society and the Highland Society, and those meetings were not really so much about telling me information. It's about giving me, kind of contacts for people that I could kind of speak to. And then sometimes, when I'd be flipping through a book and I'd find somebody, an author or a historian that, was still in kind of the maritime area, I could reach out to them and maybe kind of set up an interview that way as well. So, So I guess kind of a little bit of column A, a little bit of column B, and some of the column C as well. So,
yeah. What about you, Tasha?
I would say the same experiences as both of you guys. I took the information I already had in my head, or like the connections I've had prior, and I reached out to them, and they were able to give me some more names of people who to connect with. Sarah's been a great help too. She's always passing on information to us. So I always jot those down when we're at our meetings. And one thing I noticed that sometimes when you're reaching out to people and where life gets so busy, they don't always return your message, which is totally fine. But then you have to remind yourself as the interviewer that you have to sometimes send that friendly reminder or message being like, hi, like I reached out if you're still interested. And then I find one of the issues I had was scheduling. I think like they wanted to meet up, but then with the pandemic and stuff like that did cause a lot of issues to meet up. And now thankfully things have, subsided. It's nice to get out there and be hands-on, face-to-face talking to people. Another thing was I never did a telephone interview before, I realized, until I started this career. So then I had a couple of those, like that's fun and a new experience. Because a lot of time when people think interview, they automatically, well, in my opinion, most are thinking, like you said, verbally, face-to-face, or with a list of questions. I feel like that's what I was taught in high school. Right. But then when you get out in the university and stuff like that, and you're doing your research, or it's just fun to see how many different ways an interview can be conducted.
Yeah, I mean, most of mine were done via either Zoom or a phone call, because a lot of the people that I did interview were either not from the area or not currently in the area, or, some of them were a more vulnerable population with COVID, being older. So we just all kind of felt more comfortable doing it over the phone, and that was just as nice. But I do look forward to maybe reaching out to those people again and seeing if we sit down face to face, if those conversations go a little bit further. But I think that's another important thing in terms of bringing comfort to people who are curious about chatting with us. We're very flexible. Like, we'll do a phone call, we'll do in person, we can do a Zoom, we can do you rather written it down, having it written down? We'll do email, you tell us, we'll do it. Because at the end of the day, we want to make sure that everybody that's involved with these interviews are comfortable and are able to just have like a fun experience out of it, to be able to tell us their stories and to tell us what they want to share with us in a no pressure environment.
Absolutely.
because the pressure is real on both sides.
Yeah, exactly.
So that's one good thing about, I guess, this research, right? It's an ethnographic research, what we're doing. So we're telling story and we're giving people a voice. So we're documenting things that are, I guess the two researchers or three researchers. I just forget Sean. You're also a researcher too. So you guys are documenting people's stories as is. We're not trying to put things around, try to make it statisticals or analyze it. We're documenting the story as people tell the story. So, which makes it more interesting because we're talking about the Miramichi, and there's so much rich culture here and so much interesting stories, even for myself being here for a couple of years. I'm still learning about a lot of things. I'm still discovering things. So I think that's what makes this research great, is because you're telling people stories and you're documenting, and this is what's needed even in every culture. With living in Ill Ground or working with First Nations and doing things with First Nation, I find that there's a lot of rich stories and rich history and culture, and I wish this was happening years ago, because we lost some elders that had so many information that they had, and I think it's very important that these stories are documented and, even to back up, because when you hear something oral, you go back and you look at the landscape or you look at documentation and you kind of parallel things and you say, oh yeah, this really happened. Because we can see something that's written and we read about it, but to actually hear from a person that experienced some of the events brings life to that story, and which is really interesting, which is really great about, I listen to all of you when you tell a story when we get together, and I'm like, this is really nice, I'm learning from all directions.
And to kind of build on that, Sarah, I know myself, there was at least one gentleman that I did have a chance to speak to, and he's since passed away. So, I was very grateful to speak with him anyway. But, I think, understanding now that I was able to kind of record, some of his stories before he passed on, it kind of adds another layer of significance to that conversation.
It makes you kind of think about it. I know those conversations that we've had throughout our meetings, they got me thinking about my grandfather and my grandparents and how a lot of them had passed away. And it's like, I should start recording, even if it wasn't for work, just recording our conversations, because you don't realize how much you miss the conversations when they are gone, or like you said, all the information that just from a casual conversation, you could have figured out something new, whether it was just about your own family history is quite interesting, and then connect it with others' family history makes it more exciting in my opinion anyway. I love connecting lives to lives, because I don't know why it amazes me, but it does. I just think it's so beautiful how we can live our life and influence one another in positive ways.
I think that our interview process did kind of plant that seed for me too, that there's this importance in sitting down with our grandparents and our parents and just talking and listening, right? Letting them talk and listening to what what they lived through and what they thought was a significant part of their childhood or their young adult years, or and I think that it has the same process as when we conduct our interviews for this project, where, it starts off by saying, oh, well, milk at that time cost this much and candy cost this much. And then at the end of, an hour or two, you're talking about things you never knew your grandparents had lived through. So I think there's just a huge importance that was placed on just taking that time and listening. For me, anyway, once I really got into these interviews, it made me realize that there are stories like this in my own family that we're not taking the time to sit down and listen to.
Absolutely. I agree.
Mm-hmm.
That's the homework I'm sending out to all of our listeners. Go and sit down with your parents or your grandparents, your cousins, your aunts, your uncles, anybody. Just sit down, let them talk. Just listen. And then call us with your information.
There you go. There you go. And if you know those stories, write them down. I mean, because again, I mean, like there will come a time, that, and again, I think we've all been there, in our young adulthood when, we don't put the kind of, significance on that we should, and we come to realize it too late. You know what I mean? That, well, I certainly know I did. Like, I always remember, it was my first year working at Beau Bears, and I sat down with my dad's father, who passed away at the age of 91. And we had a conversation for about 45 minutes. I wrote none of it down. And I remember, two things, I mean, at a 45-minute conversation. And I wish I could remember, so much more. So, yeah. So when and so like I say, I'm trying to, write stuff down now that, that maybe someday, my nieces or whomever might be interested in, and, and then it's there, for them. But yeah, that's it. But like I say, I absolutely, I think it's so much richer, Ali, as you say, and Sarah, as you say, and Tasha as well, when you can hear it. You know what I mean? When you get that experience person to person, so I think, if as and when you're able, like I say, yeah, definitely. I back that homework 150%.
Yeah. Well, and I think we forget that we're living in the future's history, right? So sure. I think it's easy for us to think, like, even with me, when I started doing this research, reading through some things and trying to find information on things and just saying, like, I just wish that somebody would have written this down. Like, why did nobody write this down? I'm not writing anything down that I'm going through on a day-to-day basis, but I sure bet it would help the historians and, in the future who are trying to do this project in 100 years from now. We're trying to get information on what Miramichi was like during the pandemic. We don't, I don't know. It's almost like we don't necessarily think of right now as being anything other than the present. But at the end of the day, if we don't leave anything behind either, then we're continuing this vicious cycle of questioning history.
But I think at the same time too, kind of to your point originally about the fact that, I think a lot of people come into these interviews and say, "Oh, I mean, I don't have too much to tell you." I think I've ended most of my interviews with that person telling me, "Well, I don't think I gave you too much information. Like, you gave me so much information, yes. And that's it." But again, like, I think all of us don't really see the history that's kind of in our own time. So even if we've lived a great deal of it.
Yep.
Another thing too is that when we do document stories like that, because in history books, in newspapers, they're written about people that are in the public eye, like, politicians or somebody done something to exceed. But you never hear the story of the people that actually helped these people get where they got, or how they participated. And this research tells a story. Like, I was there when this was happening, or I did this in the background, and, we kind of get to the bottom of when something is planned or when somebody's building their life, it gives stories and history to those events too.
Actually, it's great that you went before me, Sarah, because I was pretty much going to say the same thing you just did, that it would be great to see how different people experienced it, like that wasn't in the public eye. So as I say, each community too, like that's for each culture, how they dealt with that scenario, especially the ones that are like located, right next to each other, close proximity. If an event happened, say like the Miramichi fire, for an example, all the communities, mostly the communities experience the same situation almost, but dealt with it differently or vice versa. So it's just great to see how it was
and another thing
to work through.
There's some stories that are hidden because, like, I think Tasha and I were talking about residential school, And as we're talking, she said, my grandfather never shared this with me. I'm surprised she didn't share this. And I said, because your grandfather was protecting you. So things like that were uncovered because there's hidden things that was never shared for our own protection. Or I tell the story, I guess, as I said, I come from New Mexico. So I grew up kind of during the civil rights movement, right? I got this sweatshirt for my brother, a Muhammad Ali t-shirt, my sweatshirt, more or less. It says, I'm the greatest. I was so happy I got this sweatshirt, right? A few days later, it disappeared. I couldn't find it. But I didn't know the consequences of wearing the Muhammad Ali t-shirt, sweatshirt at the time. My mother hid it because, for my safety. It was when I was like coming back from Oklahoma, and my mom says, this was yours, remember? She gives me back the sweatshirt. But I did not understand. I was a child. I did not understand what was going on then. But for her to take it from me, it was for my own safety at the time. So that kind of tells you some things about history,
Right. Like, think of that story written from your point of view and that story written from your mom's point of view. Right.
Yeah.
Like, if history was written that way, if we could see all these different point of views, how much more we could understand. So I remember growing up and thinking, like, I don't need to write anything down in journals and diaries. Like, my mom journals every single night. I don't need to journal. She has everything written in there. But then here I am listening to this and being like, yeah, but my mom and I's experiences are different. We lived through the same, a lot of the things that she's written in there are big events that were huge and important for both of us. And we lived them in completely different ways.
And do you find that in the interviews too? Do you find a lot of, people talking about the same events kind of from different angles, I guess, or from different perspectives?
Yes.
I'm trying to think if many people on my end have really brought up specific events that were repeated. And I don't think we've hit that so far, but I would love to even if we can think of like one event and just kind of throw it out there and say, hey, if you attended this or if you lived through this, please reach out to us. We would love to hear your experience of that event or that moment, and just have kind of like a compilation of everybody's experiences. That'd be interesting. But no, I haven't had any of that happen yet, but now I really want it to happen.
I was trying to think too, but I couldn't fully think of anything off the top of my head at this moment. I have to go through all the stuff I've written down or recorded.
What about you, Sean? Have you had anybody that's not yet, eh?
Not really. Not really. I mean, I think kind of different perspectives on kind of like broad events.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? But not something specifically.
Yeah.
I think probably the closest I may have gotten was, something like, the Second World War or something.
Right.
You know what I mean? You got to let, but it's such a big event that, there are so many perspectives on that, and they're not necessarily things about the same individual event within that larger narrative.
Yeah. So I'm even thinking like we've had so many big events in the greater Miramichi area that there are people who lived through it who are still alive, or who have, maybe it's the children or grandchildren of those people who might still have their family members' experience either written down or memorized, or who knows how they have it saved. But I think that would be an interesting call to action for us to have at some point, to just kind of see what people experienced and how.
Well, stay tuned, dear listeners and viewers.
The difference I notice is that in Western culture, you probably find a lot of things like you said, journal, written things down. But it's kind of amazing how when we talk to our elders in the First Nations community, how they remember things. They sometimes they point to dates, sometimes they point to events, but they're not written down. But their mind is so sharp, telling the stories.
Yeah, I think Acadians have a lot of that same way of keeping stories. I think that it's a lot of, I think both of our communities are storytellers, right? Where that's an important part of family time and community time is we sit down and we share stories. But it's not shared stories from a book or from, pen and paper. It really is, here's a story that my mother told me, whose mother told her, whose mother told her. And and I know, Sarah, you had kind of talked about this before, about how this story naturally changes, but it's that it doesn't make it any less true.
I totally agree with that, because I find every time my grandfather would tell me a story, there was like a little new piece in there. So I always listened, even though most, like 99% of it was the same. But I'm like, there's always that one little time that he mentioned something new. So I'm like, I'm all ears.
Yeah, exactly. Well, friends, we have reached the end of our third episode. Do we have any parting words?
Well, if you are interested in speaking with us, the information I think is going to be displayed on your screen right now, maybe as I'm talking, and will certainly be in the description below. So we encourage you again that if you've got some things to share with us or some research that you've done, we'd certainly love to speak with you. We're hopeful that in the course of these 3 episodes, we've demonstrated that we're all very approachable and very nice people. That's it. That our disguises have not slipped in the last 90 minutes that we've spent with you. So that's it. And we promise that they won't slip during the interviews. That's right. That's it. Well, anyway, so yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, we can't end this podcast without having only our favorite segment, where Sean sings the outro.
Oh, okay, yeah. I mean, I had 3 weeks to prepare for this, and I didn't.
You knew this was coming.
I wasted it. So that's it. So anyway, that's it. So yeah, the best I can come up with is I mean, it won't be a song, but I mean, it'll rhyme.
We'll take it.
So here we go. That's it. As a friend of mine says, you get what you get, so don't get upset. So that's it. So here's to all of you, as good as you are, and here's to me, as bad as I am, as good as you are, and as bad as I am, I'm as good as you are, as bad as I am. So there you go. We'll see you next week. All the best. Thank you so much.